Welcome back to the Thom Hartmann Program. I'm Danielle here with Shano sitting in for Tom today, and we are joined by Arun Kundnani, lecturer of New York University, writer on issues of race, Islamophobia, political violence, and surveillance, and author of several books, the latest being The Muslims Are Coming, Islamophobia, Extremism, and the Domestic War on Terror. Arun, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We had the pleasure this morning of watching your recent interview or panel discussion on CNN, and may I first just commend you for standing up to bigotry and Islamophobia and directly saying exactly how big of a problem it is in this country, especially on major networks like CNN. So thank you for that, and I apologize on behalf of my fellow Americans. How does that type of rhetoric that we hear from presidential candidates, from generals, and from political pundits actually translate into what happens with Muslims, with the war on terror, and with terrorist attacks in our country and throughout the world?
Well, I think we have seen an increase in racist violence within the United States against Muslims, particularly over the last 5 or 6 years. This is one of the interesting things, is that, that kind of common sense reaction would be to say, well, maybe there was a spontaneous reaction after the trauma of 9/11, which to some extent would be understandable. But in fact, when you look at the data, the real increase in hate crimes against Muslims happens from about 2010 onwards, and is increasing this year as well. So it's not really about a spontaneous reaction. It's about a deliberate campaign to fuel hatred against Muslims that we've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, especially. And then, and I think the kind of rhetoric that we've seen from Trump is obviously fueling that. But it's wider than that. We have legitimized this kind of Islamophobia, not just because of these conservative figures, but also just in the way that we have institutionalized these ways of thinking in the United States. So, when the New York Police Department publicly says that every mosque in the city should be under surveillance, when across the political spectrum people talk about not letting in Syrian refugees simply because they're Syrian, when we have put 1.2 million people on our terrorism watch list, all of this fuels this sense that there is a community that has a problem and that is a threat, and that does lead to all kinds of forms of violence, both the hate crimes within the United States and the violence that the government inflicts around the world in our name, through its drone strike, through the wars that we fight or that we sponsor, through the authoritarian regimes that we back.
Now, I want to quickly remind everybody, we're speaking with Arun Kundnani, the author of The Muslims Are Coming, Islamophobia, Extremism, and the Domestic War on Terror. How do we counteract this narrative? It's become so powerful, as you said. It's become institutionalized. Even in the president's speech, which was meant to calm the rhetoric, there was some underlying idea that Muslims are to blame for a few radical people in the Middle East committing violence. How on earth do we begin to counteract that narrative?
Right. So here's the first thing that we need to do is we need to, particularly the people who are liberals. What I've heard a lot of over the last 2 years is people responding to Trump in this very pragmatic way of saying, well, if we say this stuff like what Trump's saying, then it plays really bad in the Middle East and it will fuel the problem of terrorism, as if Americans say the wrong thing and suddenly there's a horde of terrorists coming, which is, again, just reinforcing this idea. So what we need is principled stands, not pragmatic stands. We need to say we have a problem of racism, and we know from our history what that looks like and where that can go. So we need to, as a society, unite and take a stand on the principle of this, not pragmatic arguments, on the principle. And I don't hear enough of us doing that. And one way to put that into practice may be to say, let's boycott Trump's businesses, and make that a way of expressing our opposition, not just to what he's saying, but to the whole problem of anti-Muslim racism in our society. We need to remember that the movement from which Islamophobia comes is the same movement that is opposed to immigrant rights for people from around the world, but especially from Latin America. It is the same movement that is trying to prevent any kind of change to the institutional racism in our law enforcement agencies against black people in America. So we need to think about the alliances that we can build here across communities. The majority of people in this society, I think, are now in a position where we need to stand up and reject this idea of what America is. And we have our own idea of what America is, which is very different. And it's time to put that into practice in a much more forceful way.
Yeah, very well said. I often say, that our Statue of Liberty doesn't have an asterisk. It doesn't say, give me your tired, your poor, but not your Muslims. It doesn't say that. That's not how this country was founded. One of my biggest frustrations in the media recently is this constant false call for Muslims to speak out against terrorism, which they, do en masse every single time an event occurs. Do you think it would be helpful at all to kind of turn that on its head and say that it's time for each of us to speak out against hateful rhetoric, against rhetoric that could lead to more violent extremism among Muslims just as much as among the racist crowd that commits crimes and commits hatred and violent acts against Muslims?
Well, my way of thinking about this is, yes, I think we should condemn, when something like San Bernardino happens, of course, we should condemn that violence, right? And if an imam asked me for my advice, I would say, yes, please take a stand and condemn this violence against civilians. But let's also, if we're going to do that, if we're going to condemn that violence against civilians, if we're going to do that without hypocrisy, we also need to condemn the civilians that get killed by our own government in drone strikes.
Absolutely.
And so let's condemn that violence at the same time, and let's have all sections of society condemn all these different kinds of violence. We're in a cycle of violence. We're not just the victims of terrorism, we're the perpetrators of terrorism as well. So we need to understand that we need a peace movement, right? That can't be a peace movement for them and a war movement for us. It needs to be a peace movement for everyone. And so I think that's the way to look at it. We need to think about all the forms of political violence in our society. Those kinds of acts of violence carried out by Muslims, but also those that are carried out by far right-wing extremists that cause a large number of deaths. We need to understand the deaths of black people in America at the hands of law enforcement as a kind of political violence, as a kind of terrorism. Yeah. Perhaps the oldest kind of terrorism in the United States. So, I think we can start. The way to link these issues together and to think about them coherently is to think of this as a matter of peace. Are we able to imagine a peace movement in the United States today? And this is something that Martin Luther King, I think, was one of the...
One second.
Yeah.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
As Tom says, that guy always steps on me. Arun, thank you so much for standing for peace. And I will watch that CNN interview on a loop later this evening. It was awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
To watch more clips from our programs, hit the Watch More Videos button over here. And please be sure to hit the handy-dandy subscribe button so you'll always be up to date. Tag, you're it.